Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to installment number 2 in our series about dealing with your worst fears when it comes to clients and working with clients as a commercial illustrator. Today's broad topic is communication and revisions. And fear and uncertainty about communication with a client and about managing revisions. Those are some of the most common themes that came up in the questions that you all sent in. Not the questions, but the fears, I guess. The fears that you all confessed and shared on Instagram and Twitter. And to be honest, that doesn't surprise me at all because some of these fears are the ones that I still feel the most acutely today. Some of the fears that we're talking about are things that I definitely really felt very strongly at the beginning, and I've learned to kind of work through them. This is not one of those things. This is one of those areas where I still, it's probably the biggest thing that I fear in any project going into it is worrying that something is going to go off the rails with the communication or that there's going to be some hiccup or challenge with the revision. So I'm trying to be really honest with you guys in this series and not act like I have all the answers to these things. I'm going to share what I do know and what has helped me. Building in some of that structure, some of those specific things that I will share today, can help really kind of mitigate some of that uncertainty and the discomfort that comes with the uncertainty. But as I said quite a lot in the last video, you're never going to be able to completely eliminate the uncertainty. So we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about more concrete things than we did in the last video. But if kind of what you feel like you struggle with is more the internal battle and continuing to keep moving and keep working towards your goals, even when you feel fearful or uncertain, and you haven't watched last week's video, then you should maybe go watch that one first. For today, we are going to go ahead and just dive right in and tackle some of these specific fears about communication and revision and some of the things that you can do to hopefully help make it a little bit easier to dive in. Fear number 1 is the fear that I won't be able to understand what the client really wants and that I won't be able to communicate clearly my own capabilities and limitations. So first off, communicating your own, not just your own capabilities and limitations, but your own work, showing your actual work, having your consistent body of artwork, your portfolio that you put out there. That's your number 1. You're going to first layer of your communication process, your first tool for showing clients who you are and what you can do as an artist. So that's why you're going to hear me harping on and on throughout the series about the importance of having a consistent portfolio. If you do that well, if you have a large enough, consistent enough portfolio, over time, more and more clients will be choosing you because of what's in your portfolio. So they will already know what your capabilities and probably your, maybe not specifically your limitations, but they'll be coming to you because they see what is in your portfolio, and that comes from your capabilities. So over time, if you do that well, if you have that consistent portfolio, your client pool will start to self-select, and it will be people that specifically want your specific capabilities. So that is a good thing, and that's one reason why I'm mentioning portfolios again right here. But of course, that's not the whole story. Once you do have that cohesive body of 20 to 30 consistent pieces, there are, of course, other things to communicate with the client about to help facilitate that effective communication. So in addition to your consistent portfolio that the client is going to see and hopefully choose you because of, there are 2 other main things that you need to communicate to the client. The first is to have a clear, written, bulleted description of your working process. That we usually need to have 3 main components, and those are number 1, the steps that you go through every single time you create an illustration. Number 2, the length of time that each of these steps takes. And I wouldn't list out like the hours with the client necessarily, because then they'll get fixated on hourly rates and all that, and we'll talk about that later. But I would list days. So, say if you're doing like 4 sketches or something and you need 16 hours worth of work to do that, then I would list 2 days alongside that. So yes, the actual processes, the steps that you go through each time you complete an illustration, and the length of time each of those steps takes, and then the client's parts as well, what parts they'll have to play. So for example, sending you reference material or sending in feedback, those would be things that the client needs to do, parts that the client would play. And so that needs to be listed out as well. You can do what I do, which is to have a kind of broad template version of this that you keep in a document and then just adjust slightly when you send it out to different clients so that you're not starting from scratch each time. That can really help make the process a bit smoother. And the second thing to communicate here is a really clear description with the client, a really clear spelling out of what exactly they're getting. So what the deliverables are. We talked about deliverables before in different videos. I talk about it also in my Skillshare class, but some different things that you might want to list out in this section of your agreement, whether you're doing a full-on contract or just an email agreement, would be the size of the work, the medium that you're going to use, whether it's black and white or full color, if there's any significant stylistic difference from what you usually make, or maybe if you have kind of two main styles, being really clear about the style that they're going to get. So for me, my style is pretty consistent. So I tend to just say, you know, we'll create work in the artist's usual style. The one variable I have is that I do have some pieces that have more texture and some pieces that have less texture. So I will often, usually we'll spell out whether it's going to be on the more textured or the less textured side. And then of course the actual format that the client is getting it in. So if they're going to be getting digital files, then you would say, like, you know, deliver it as high-res TIFF files or whatever else. If they're getting an actual physical piece, then you would say that, and maybe even mention like how it would be shipped. So basically this is just you very specifically describing what the client is getting with the project. So those three things: having your own consistent body of work, a very clear written description of your process and what goes into each phase, and then a very clear written description of what the client is getting, what the deliverables are. That's going to take care of a lot of the communication challenges that you would potentially encounter with a client. So kind of thinking through how you might put some of those processes into practice if you haven't done that already. If you're in the aspiring illustrator boat and you haven't really worked with any clients yet, that could be worth some of your time. And I guess on that note, if you are maybe a newer illustrator, more beginner, or if you have a few different styles in your portfolio, because even though I've talked a lot about consistency and how important that is, there are still going to be some of you out there who will have an inconsistent portfolio, but get client inquiries. That may happen to some of you. And in my experience in talking with other folks, that can produce some of the most challenging situations, because if you have an unclear portfolio, sometimes the client has one idea in mind and you have another idea in mind, or sometimes if you have a very varied portfolio, a client may come to you wanting you to mimic somebody else's style, not even a style that they see listed in your portfolio. So I would say if you're a beginner, or if you don't have that really like bang on consistent portfolio that a client can refer to, I would spend a little bit of time before thinking of those three other things. I would spend a little bit of time making sure that you and the client are on the same page when it comes to style. You can tackle this in a few different ways. You can send them a number of different examples from your portfolio. So just grab some examples of your work. Send those to them. You can send them a link to your portfolio if you want. You can put things in a PDF. And when you do that, be sure that you highlight the ways that those different stylistic approaches are different. So if, you know, one of them is an ink drawing and one of them is a watercolor illustration, just like really being very explicit and saying, did you want something that's more in the style of this black and white ink illustration? Or do you want something that's more in the style of this more rendered watercolor and colored pencil illustration? Ask those questions. Ask the client directly, ask them specifically. Make sure that you're not just assuming that they, even if they say, I want something like this, and they show you one example of a piece, show them some other examples too. Basing the entire stylistic thing, your entire stylistic direction off of one piece can be challenging, unless you know very concretely, very specifically what it is that the client likes about that piece. So if you are going to go just off of one piece, really drill down and make sure you're understanding what it is that the client likes, because it's kind of like, you are two different people looking at the same thing, but you can take very different things away from it. You know, I don't know if you've heard or seen, I feel like I've heard about this in like a million different podcasts, but like people, when they take eyewitness accounts of different events that have happened, like a car accident or some mass tragedy or whatever, and they ask people about it afterwards, people remember very different things. So this is like that. You may both be looking at the same piece, but you can't just assume that you're drawing the same conclusions about it or taking away the same things. So be sure to ask those questions, to show some other examples, and get really clear on the style before you go into laying out the process and the deliverables. And that is mainly if you're in the situation where you don't have a really consistent portfolio. This isn't something I worry about quite as much because I do have a consistent portfolio. But if ever I have any doubt about it, or if the client sends me, 5 examples from my portfolio and I'm like, that makes sense, that makes sense. And then like a 6th one that's from some image search that they did is totally out of nowhere, then I will drill down a bit further to make sure I understand why they included that and what they're trying to get at stylistically. And a phone call can be helpful at this point, but just remember, if you do decide to do the phone call, to either take notes yourself and then send those to the client and get them to sign off on them, or to ask the client to write out their thoughts in an email and send them to you, just so that you have a written record of this. Yes. Okay. So I think we're done with that point. To recap, you want to get clear on the style goal, either by having that really consistent portfolio, or by doing just what we have finished talking, or by doing what we just talked about right now, sending different stylistic examples and getting clear in it that way. Lay out your process, and then really clearly describe the deliverables. So doing those 3 things will take care of a lot of communication difficulties with many or most clients. All right, next fear. This one's pretty basic. Fear that the client will not like what I make. And I still feel that one. I think everybody who makes stuff, even if you're not making stuff for clients, if you're making stuff for your Instagram audience or for a family member, that fear of like, I made this for you and here it is, that's like a very vulnerable moment, regardless of what you're making. I even sometimes feel that way when I make dinner for my family. I'm like, I made this, I hope you like it. Yeah, it's such a human feeling, and something that I'm sure can all really relate to. Hopefully some of the above steps that we just mentioned, ways that you can kind of get clear on your communication with the client and feel more confident going in that you guys are on the same page. Hopefully that will make that fear feel a little bit less powerful, but it really probably will not ever go away completely, because the thing that is underneath that, if you dig down underneath that fear that the client isn't going to like what you made, the fear that's there is rejection. And we already were talking about that some in last week's video. And again, it's just such a universal human fear. It's something that we all struggle with. We all have these kind of tribal needs to be accepted, needs to be one of the group, needs to have our abilities and gifts valued. So that's just absolutely universal. It's going to be a part of the equation no matter what you do. And unfortunately, even if you have a truly watertight onboarding process and a super consistent portfolio, and really just top-notch, excellent communication skills, there will still be times that you will make work, show it to the client, and they will not like it and or want changes. This is just a part of being an illustrator, a part of being a commercial illustrator who works with clients. So if you just know that you cannot deal with that, then this may not be the right industry for you. But it's just, it's a fact of life. I mean, no matter what you do, there will be feedback. So there's no way to avoid that because we're all humans doing this together, and all of our communication skills, even if they're structured, are imperfect. So managing that feedback, actually taking it and incorporating it and rolling it into the work in a way that makes sense to both you and the client is a part of your job as a commercial illustrator. So incorporating the feedback, handling the feedback well, is yet again another question of building some of those good systems and structures, which is what we're going to unpack in the next fear. All right, third and final fear is, what if the client asks for a big change last minute, or worse, they pull the plug altogether? And related to that, what if I'm literally not able to accommodate their visions because of working in traditional media? So if you work in traditional media, you know that there comes a point in any piece where there are just certain things that can't be changed. Well, I guess certain kinds of certain kinds of traditional media, not all traditional media, but there are limitations. Traditional media artists have certain limitations that digital media artists do not have. So yes, what if the client asks for these big changes? What if they can't be done? What if the client pulls the plug and walks away? All right, so there is no universal formula for handling revisions. Because each artist's work is a bit different. And as I just mentioned, traditional media artists have different limitations than digital media artists do. But regardless, I think probably for every commercial illustrator, 2 basic principles that you want to keep in mind for revisions are to limit them to a specific number. There's not any number that you have to do. There's huge variability here. I know artists who do something like 7 revisions, which just seems insane to me. And I do usually somewhere between 2 to 3. So yes, limiting your revisions to a specific number. All right, and the second point related to this is building your revision process, planning your revision process so that the revisions go along with kind of key points in your process where it's easier to make changes. So for example, if you plan to make any compositional changes that involve like moving objects or adding different things to the composition, it'll be a lot easier to do that if you do it at the sketch phase as opposed to doing it once you've actually painted for most people and most processes. So thinking through there's never going to be a completely pain-free time to incorporate revisions, to make changes that you weren't planning on making, but there are times when it is more painful and times when it is less painful. So think about what are the key points in your process when you can make revisions and have it be a little bit less painful. And then you'll start coaching the client to give you feedback at those phases so that it's a little bit more in your control. So to figure out your own revision process, you have to first be really clear on what your artistic process is. What are the steps that you walk through every single time you create an illustration? I know that there may be some variability, and this will be a little bit trickier if you haven't reached that kind of consistent level where your output is relatively predictable. But yes, try to sit down and think through what is involved each time I create an illustration. What are the steps that I always walk through? While you're doing that, you might want to kind of start thinking through how long each of those steps takes. You can even start paying attention when you create work to like, oh wow, I spent 2 hours looking for reference images or taking reference images. I hadn't really factored that into my process before. So, starting to take some notes, starting to have an awareness around what goes into your process, how long each of those things takes. And once you have that specific bulleted list all written out, you can look at it and ask yourself, when are the easiest points to make changes? And there are different kinds of changes that clients will make. So, sometimes it'll be a change like, well, can you lighten this color or darken that color? And of course, you can't really do that until the color phase. And some clients will want to move things around. As we talked about just a moment ago, you can do that during the sketch phase. It's hard for me to make a universal rule here because everyone's process is so different, but you know what your process is. Think through when you make those kinds of decisions yourself. So if it's a compositional change, when are you making those compositional changes for the most part? If it's a color change or texture change, when are you making those for the most part? And that's kind of a good guiding point or a good starting point for where you would ask a client for that specific kind of feedback, and you'd coach a client to give you that kind of feedback. So you can't just tell the client, you get 2 revisions or you get 4 revisions and let them decide, because they don't know what they're doing. And even if they do know what they're doing, even if they're an art director and they have a lot of experience, different illustrators have different processes, and they're a newbie, they're a beginner when it comes to you and your process. So you have to tell them what kind of feedback you need when. So I coach my clients whenever I say, like, there's going to be X many rounds of revision. I tell them, like, this is what you do at this round. This is the kind of revision that is happening at this round. And that way, if at the very end of a project, they say, actually, can you just like move this person's hand so it's, cradling their face instead of it's on their hip? I can say, I'd be happy to do that, but it's going to expand the scope of the project. So it's going to expand the timeline and the budget as well, because this was something that needed to be dealt with at the compositional phase rather than at the final phase. So I've already started to talk about that a little bit, but let me just tell you concretely about my own process. I typically do 2 to 3 rounds of revision at very set points. If I'm doing something that is very straightforward, like the client sends me a reference image and I'm just drawing that reference image, I don't usually do any sort of thumbnail or concept, because basically the reference image is the concept. So in that instance, I would just do a sketch, and then they have to make any compositional changes at all at the sketch phase. So moving something around, changing the size, changing the orientation, adding another element, all of that has to happen at the sketch phase. And once that's complete, then I do the actual painting. And the next time they see it, it's a finished painting. And so at that point, all they can ask for are changes to the color. So making, a certain area maybe a little bit darker or lighter, adding a deeper shadow, maybe tweaking temperature. And as a traditional media artist, some of that I have to do digitally. So, if they want a specific green to be a little bit cooler, the perfectionist, like pure artist part of me that's like, oh, I need to actually do it on the painting itself. Like I need to scrap it. I need to go back and change the color. I need to start all over again. But that's just insane. And if you want to actually work in commercial illustration, or you have real deadlines and you're constantly doing projects, you have to be willing to do some of these things in the more expedient way rather than in the more romantic way. So if a client wants a temperature change on green, I will just pull it in the computer. I'll pull it into Pixelmator, which is what I use, and tweak the temperature that way. So yeah, those are the kinds of things that the client could change at the final phase, but nothing like, adding an additional, if it's a bowl of peaches and they want to move one of the peaches. No, that can't happen unless they're okay with expanding the scope, which includes expanding the timeline and the budget. So doing this, communicating really clearly about your process for revisions, when the revisions fall in your process, how many they get, and what kind of changes are included in each revision phase. So what kind of feedback they should be giving you in each revision phase. That is going to hopefully take care of most of the problems, most of the challenges and difficulties with revisions. A lot of the time when clients ask for out of scope revisions, they're doing it because they don't know. They don't know that it's out of scope, and we have assumed that they would understand. I communicate this kind of information to the client like 3 different ways. I do it in the email, and if we have a call, I do it in a call as well. So maybe even 4 different ways. And I do it in a formal contract. And so no, I guess 3 ways: email, formal contract, and then if there's any sort of a call. Did I just say 3? Oh my goodness. My brain, you guys. So doing that well is going to take care of a lot of these. You're going to kind of cut off the potential for trouble before it even happens. But that being said, it will still happen sometimes. There will be, just like there will be revisions, there will still be out of scope revisions. And this happens either because, as we've talked about, we are all human, so our communication is imperfect. So it could be some sort of miscommunication, something that the client didn't read, something that you maybe didn't say as clearly as you could have. It could also be, this happens a lot with clients that I work with, that their goal changed slightly and they need to shift the content of the illustration to match that. Even though that can happen, that shouldn't dissuade you from being clear about your process and your revisions up front. Actually, I think it should encourage you to do that, because the rarer circumstances when there are out of scope revisions, well, yeah, it'll take care of 80% of them. Once I started getting really clear on what revisions were allowed and when they were supposed to happen, most client revision processes just went way smoother, completely smooth or much smoother. And then the rare times when it does go out of scope, it's much easier for me to refer back and say, okay, yep, happy to do that, but this is going to increase the budget. This is going to increase the timeline because of, this per our agreement, etc. And if you are conflict averse like me, it's not going to make that part of the process pain-free or easy. I won't lie to you, it's still very difficult, but it's much easier for me, more possible for me to assert and hold a boundary that is already existing, that I've already stated from the beginning of the relationship, than it is to try to build a new boundary and get client buy-in when you're already in the middle of the process. So yes, it can be kind of a pain and maybe can feel like a little bit nitpicky or legally to try to be like very concrete with your revision process up front, but it's going to save you so much headache in the end. All right, you guys, I think that is it for this video. Next week, we are going to be talking about deadlines and I guess, yeah, more conversation about boundaries. So kind of a good little tie-in. We're just ending on boundaries. We'll talk about boundaries again next week, some other specific kinds of boundaries boundaries. So that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Thank you to my patrons for supporting this channel. Leave your comments in the comments section. Give the video a thumbs up if you liked it, and please do subscribe if you're new. Yeah, and I guess, yeah, that's really it. I'm so terrible at wrapping videos up. I got to come up with like I need a system. That's what I need. I need something concrete. All right, you guys, I hope you have a great weekend. I will see you next week. Bye.